everyone. We will be presenting discussion number 4, Quantitative Methods, chapters 2 and 3 of Macmillan and Wergan, and chapter 8 of Creswell. The presenters are Taylor Bennett, Jennifer Green, Shelley Herseth, and Julie Oberreiter. Chapter 2 and 3 of Macmillan and Wergan and chapter 8 of Creswell describe non-experimental and experimental quantitative research. In this presentation, we will describe the two types of quantitative research and the components of each of them. Creswell lays out steps when designing the methods section of a quantitative study of either the survey design or experimental design. Macmillan and Wergan go into deeper discussion of the quantitative non-experimental design and experimental design. More specifically, they talk about 4 different types of non-experimental designs and 3 different types of experimental designs that we will discuss later. There are 4 types of non-experimental designs presented by Macmillan and Wergan. These 4 were mentioned earlier as descriptive, correlational, comparative, and developmental. The purpose of the descriptive non-experimental research is to use frequencies, percentages, averages, and other simple statistics to offer an explanation of the data that has been collected. In a correlational study, there are at least 2 measured variables for each subject in this type of study. Correlational studies show the direction and magnitude of relationships. Bivariate correlation relates one variable to another. They can be positive, negative, 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 and negative, positive. The closer to -1 or +1, the stronger the relationship. A common type of correlational analysis is multiple correlation, multiple regression, logistic regression analysis. One or more independent variables are used to show how well they predict the dependent variable. Comparative studies provide descriptions of how 2 or more groups differ on some occurrence. For example, comparing achievement rates of male students to female students. Developmental studies examine changes in subjects over time. This involves either a longitudinal study or a cross-sectional study. Longitudinal studies are more credible, however, they are more difficult to complete because they require more time and resources. The proposal of a survey design is to introduce the readers to the basic purpose and rationale for a selection for the proposed study design. In this discussion, you want to identify the purpose of the study, indicate the study preference and why, indicate whether the survey will be cross-sectional, data collected at one point, or longitudinal, data collected over time, and lastly, specify how the data will be collected. After the proposal of the non-experimental design, the population or sample should be discussed. In the discussion of the population, 5 aspects should be addressed. First, the population of the study should be identified. This means the size of the population should be determined as well as the way to identify the individuals. Identifying the sampling design is next. This means the researcher needs to decide whether the design is single-stage or multi-stage. Single-stage procedure is where the researcher has access to names within the population and can sample the individuals directly. The multi-stage or clustering, the researcher identifies groups or organization, obtains names of individuals within those groups, then samples within them. Third, the researcher should identify the selection process of the study. This means either a random selection or a systematic selection. A random selection is just that. Individuals are selected at random. This provides a representative sample that can be generalized to a population. Systematic selection is when a researcher chooses a random start on a list and picks every X number of individuals. The researcher should determine if the population will be stratified, first before selecting the sample. Stratification is when characteristics of individuals are represented in the sample, and the sample reflects the true proportion in the population of individuals with those characteristics. Lastly, the researcher should determine the size of the sample. This is often done by selecting a percentage of the population, select the size that is typical in past studies, or base the size on the margin of error they are willing to tolerate. Types of non-experimental designs for casual links are ex post facto and casual comparative. Ex post facto, the researcher is able to identify past experiences of individuals that are consistent with an intervention and are able to compare the individuals with others that had a different intervention. Because there is no manipulation of the independent variable, it is classified as a non-experimental design. This is also a limitation of the study since the intervention has already occurred and is not manipulated in the current study. Causal comparative, the researcher observes what happens when subjects experience different interventions. The interventions, however, are not controlled by the researcher. An example would be the effect of tutoring on students and achievement scores. A limitation is that other factors can affect the subjects, could affect test scores, as in the example. There are 6 steps when it comes to analyzing the data and interpreting the results. This way, the reader can see how one step leads to another. Step 1. Report numbers of people who did or did not return the survey. This is best presented with a table of numbers and percentages. Step 2. Discuss the method in which response biases will be determined. Response biases are the effect of the non-responses of the survey. This includes using a wave analysis or respondent-non-respondent analysis. Step 3. Discuss a plan to provide a descriptive analysis of all independent and dependent variables. This should indicate the mean, standard deviations, and range of scores for these variables. Step 4. Identify statistical procedure for developing scales for descriptive approaches. Reliability checks should also be done for internal consistency of the scales. Step 5. Identify the statistics and statistical computer program for testing the research questions or hypothesis. The researcher should provide a justification for the choice of statistical test and the assumptions associated with the statistic. Step 6. Present the results in the tables and figures and interpret results from statistical tests. The researcher should draw conclusions from the results of the research question and hypothesis. Experimental designs are to test the effect of the treatment on an outcome and control other factors. For example, one group receives treatment and the other does not. There are 3 types of experimental designs outlined by McMillan and Wergen in Chapter 3. They are randomized experimental, quasi-experimental, and pre-experimental. The randomized experiment is when the researchers randomly assign individuals to either a control group or an experimental group. This helps to ensure that the groups being compared don't differ in factors. Quasi-experimental is when there is no random assignment of subjects. For example, a researcher might use 2 different classrooms to compare 2 different types of instruction. Lastly, a pre-experimental design does not use random assignment but is not called a quasi-experiment because there is no pretest or comparison group. According to Creswell, the experimental method discussion follows a typical form. Topics covered in the methods are participants, materials, procedures, and measures. The most important things the readers need to know about in the participant sections are how they are selected, the assignment into groups, and how many participants will participate in the study. There are 2 ways to select participants for an experiment. The first is random selection. Each individual has an equal probability of being selected. This helps provide an accurate representation of the population. This is also a true experiment. The second way is a non-random selection, also known as a convenient sample. This is used in quasi-experimental designs where participants are selected from an already naturally formed group like a classroom. After individuals are selected, they are then put into 2 groups, a control or experimental. If they are randomly assigned, it's true experiment, and not randomly, again, is a quasi-experiment. A researcher may choose to match participants. This would help account for variables in the design of the experiment that could influence the outcome. Participants have a specific trait or characteristic that might be assigned to each group to help balance the groups. Researchers often use a power analysis to identify an appropriate sample size for each group. In the variables section, the variables should be specified clearly to the reader so that there is no question about which group is receiving experimental treatment and the outcomes being measured. The independent variables should be clearly identified, and at least one independent variable needs to be the treatment variable. The dependent variables should also be identified. Dependent variable is influenced by the independent treatment or other independent variables. During an experiment, a researcher may use a pre-test and post-test to make observations or obtain measures. There should be a clear discussion of the types of instruments used in the study. The researcher should describe the instruments that the participants used during the experiment. The established validity and reliability scores should be reported, as well as permission from the developer of the test. There should be enough discussion of the materials used within the study, for example, a computer-assisted learning program used by a teacher. During the procedures discussion of the study, identifying what is being compared, or the experiment design, identifying what is being compared, and a diagram should be included for the reader. Types of experimental designs include either random, quasi, or pre-experimental. The researcher should also identify what is being compared by either between subject design or within group design. A diagram is also helpful in showing the specific research design to be used. However, a standard notation system should be used for the figure. There are many factors that can affect the validity of an experiment. This can affect an experimenter's aptitude to determine that the intervention affects an outcome and not another factor. Content, predictive, concurrent, and construct validity are reported by authors to establish validity in quantitative research, which determines whether meaningful inferences can be drawn from the scores. There are two types of threats to validity, internal and external. Internal are participants that have certain experiences or unexpected problems with the procedures which affect the researcher from being able to draw inferences from the data. This includes extraneous events, selection, maturation of participants, and experimenter effects. External validity are threats that come up because the researchers draw incorrect conclusions from the sample data and relate them to other people, settings, or past future circumstances. External validity is concerned with generalizing the findings. The reader should be told about the types of statistical analysis that will be used. This comes up in the data analysis report. A report of the descriptive statistics should be included. This involves the number of people in the sample and the mean, standard deviation, and ranges of outcome. The inferential statistics should be used to examine the hypothesis. Tests are the t-test, univariate analysis of variance, ANOVA, analysis of covariance, ANCOVA, or multivariate analysis of variance, MANOVA. The final step in the process is the interpretation of results. This includes addressing the hypothesis, and research questions were supported or refuted, considering if the treatment made a difference on participants, suggestions on why results were significant, addressing why results might have occurred, and indicating the implication of the results for the population. Creswell and McMillan and Wergen provide a lot of information on quantitative research. This includes non-experimental and experimental designs. Creswell focuses a lot on survey design and talking about non-experimental research. However, McMillan and Wergen point out other types of non-experimental research. Validity is very important when evaluating research. Can the experiment be reproduced? Are there factors that may have limited the findings to the research? The researcher should rule out all threats of validity to their experiment. Here are the questions for the two discussions, and here are references. Hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you for listening.